Welcome to this deep dive all about trust and cooperation. Looks like you've given us quite a mix of stuff to go through, excerpts from The Wisdom of Crowds. A bunch of studies, too. It seems like we're trying to figure out, well, can we trust the systems we rely on, you know?
Hmm.
And maybe even more importantly, how do trust and cooperation even work in the real world?
Yeah, some great questions there.
We've got an expert in economics and social behavior to help us make sense of it all.
I'm excited to dive in. This is going to be interesting for sure.
Going through all this, one thing that really jumped out at me was this idea that, well, capitalism, a system we usually associate with greed and self-interest, right?
Hmm.
It might actually be like a breeding ground for trust. How does that even make sense?
It's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? Like, think about it. Just buying something simple,
Wow.
a CD player. I mean, you're trusting this whole chain of complete strangers, right? From whoever's making it to the shipping companies and all that, to actually deliver what they promise.
Yeah, that's true. I never thought about that way.
And that simple act, just buying a CD player, it shows something really fundamental about how capitalism works, you know? We're constantly relying on people we've never even met, probably halfway around the world even, to do what they said they'd do. And none of that would be possible without this foundation of trust.
So it's like self-interest, that drive to make a profit, it's actually what makes this whole system of trust work.
Yeah, exactly. Businesses, they act honestly, not just because it's, the right thing to do or whatever, but because it's in their own best interest to maintain that trust, right? If a company's always delivering bad products or scamming people, they're going to lose business.
Right, that makes sense.
And that's where the legal stuff and the institutions come in. They're like a safety net, a way to make sure contracts are followed, that bad actors get punished.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the material you sent, it also shows how that trust, especially in those big institutions, can be, well, exploited, I guess, like the stock market bubble in the late 90s.
Oh, absolutely. The stock market bubble, it created this whole environment where the potential for short-term gains was just so huge, it overshadowed any concern for long-term consequences, really.
But I'm sure some CEOs tried to resist, right? Tried to do the right thing. Why do you think they weren't able to change anything?
Well, it's complicated. There's a lot of factors at play. Part of it is how the incentives are set up. When CEOs get rewarded mostly for how the stock is doing right now, in the short term, it creates this immense pressure to prioritize immediate gains over long-term sustainability.
I see. So the system is kind of working against them.
And then there's the issue of regulatory oversight. Or, well, the lack of it, really.
So the watchdogs weren't watching closely enough, I guess.
Kind of, yeah. Institutions like Wall Street firms, accounting agencies, all the ones supposed to prevent fraud and keep things transparent, they ended up prioritizing profits over their duty to sort out the trustworthy companies from the fraudulent ones.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? Trust is like the engine of capitalism. It makes it all go. But that same trust, it makes the whole system vulnerable to abuse, especially when those short-term incentives outweigh the long-term considerations.
Yeah.
And that vulnerability, it's not just in the financial world either. One of the things you sent takes us into the world of television ratings.
Yeah.
And this kind of strange thing they call sweeps. Could you explain how that works?
Sure. So sweeps are these periods, usually February, May, July, and November, where Nielsen uses these viewer diaries to collect really detailed viewership data. This data is what determines how much advertisers pay for those TV spots. But the weird thing is, the rest of the year, the data is a lot less, comprehensive.
Oh, so for 8 months of the year, the data that's deciding millions of dollars in ad revenue is based on what people remembering what they watched. That seems pretty outdated, doesn't it? Especially now with streaming and all this on-demand content.
Yeah, you're right. It does seem out of date. And this is where we get to what's called collective action problems. You see, everyone in the industry would benefit from accurate data year-round. But no single player has the incentive to really invest in a better system, because the benefits would be shared,
So it's a case of let someone else deal with it.
Exactly. Plus, there's this extra twist. The way the industry's structured right now actually keeps the flawed system in place. It's because the affiliates, the ones paying for the sweeps, they actually benefit from this diary system because it tends to inflate their ratings, especially during those sweeps periods.
So you have a collective action problem, and then on top of that, this weird incentive structure that's actually making things worse. No wonder it's so hard to change.
Yeah, you've got it.
Speaking of collective action problems and incentives, let's talk about taxes. You sent some research about this, and it was framed as Conditional cooperation. What does that even mean?
So, conditional cooperation means that people are more likely to cooperate in this case, to pay their taxes when they think that other people are doing the same. It also depends on whether they trust the system to actually enforce the rules and punish the people who don't pay.
So it's not just about being afraid of getting audited.
Yeah.
It's more about a sense of fairness and shared responsibility.
Exactly. Studies have shown time and time again that there are three main things that influence whether people pay their taxes or not: trust in their neighbors, trust in the government, and trust that the state will, enforce the rules and punish the free riders.
Mm. Yeah.
The US model, while not perfect, of course, it's actually considered pretty successful globally. This kind of shows how important it is for people to be willing to contribute to the public good, even when they could easily get away with not doing it.
So collective trust,
Hmm.
it plays a huge role in making society function, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's in business, government, or even something as simple as paying our taxes. But even with good intentions, groups can still make disastrous decisions.
You're absolutely right. And that's where the tragic case of the Columbia space shuttle disaster comes in.
You sent me some pretty intense material about how the mission management team made decisions. I have to say, it's a scary reminder of how easily things can go wrong, even with really smart people in charge.
The Columbia disaster is like a textbook case of how even small groups, even ones with highly skilled people, can fall prey to cognitive biases and make choices with, well, catastrophic consequences.
You mentioned their verdict-based approach. You said that was a key factor in the tragedy. Can you tell me more about what that looked like?
So the mission management team, instead of thoroughly evaluating all the evidence and possibilities, they seemed to come to a decision prematurely. They decided that the foam strike wasn't a big threat. And from that point on, it was like they were filtering all the new information through that initial decision.
So instead of looking at the situation objectively, they were looking for evidence to support what they already believed. Isn't that what they call confirmation bias?
Exactly. And even more concerning, any dissenting voices within the team were shut down. Their whole culture discouraged debate and critical thinking, and that ultimately contributed to their failure to properly address the potential dangers.
This reminds me of something I learned about group polarization. It's that idea that sometimes group discussions, instead of making people more moderate, they actually push people towards more extreme positions.
That's one of the inherent risks with groups. And as the Columbia disaster so tragically shows, the stakes can be incredibly high when those group dynamics go wrong.
This has been some pretty heavy stuff. We've seen how trust can be this amazing force for good, but also a source of vulnerability. We've talked about how these collective action problems can really get in the way of progress. And we've learned that even super smart people can make terrible decisions when they fall prey to biases. But there's still more to uncover. When we come back, we'll dive into the world of short selling, and we'll explore the quirks of behavioral economics, and maybe we'll even talk about what all of this means for how we make our own decisions. Stick with us. Welcome back. Ready to dig into some more of this stuff about trusts and cooperation and how markets work?
Definitely. Lots more to talk about.
One of the things that I found really surprising in the material you sent was about short selling. Yeah. I got to admit, I always kind of had this negative feeling about it. This idea that people are actually profiting off a company's struggles just never sat right with me.
Yeah, I can see why short selling gets that kind of reaction. After all, it kind of goes against how we usually think about investing, right? Buy low, sell high, hoping things are going to go well. But what people often miss is how short selling can actually make the market more balanced and efficient.
Really? I don't see how that works.
Well, for one thing, short selling brings in this element of skepticism, right? It can be like a counterweight to all that optimism, especially when, it seems like everyone's getting caught up in some kind of speculative frenzy. It's like a reality check, a way to make sure that prices are actually reflecting, well, a more accurate picture of how a company's really doing.
So it's not just about betting against the company. It's more about like offering a different perspective, like being the devil's advocate for the market.
Exactly. If there's no short selling, you can get what economists call information cascades. It's when everyone starts following the crowd without really thinking critically, and that can lead to these crazy price swings, bubbles, and crashes, like we saw with the dot-com bubble back in the 90s.
Speaking of the dot-com bubble, the material you sent, it also talked about how short selling can be emotionally tough and how that might actually stop people from doing it. I can imagine it takes a certain kind of person to constantly bet against what everyone else is thinking, even if you got good analysis to back it up.
Oh, for sure. It's not easy going against the grain,
Right.
especially when the market's booming and it seems like everyone's making money, right? There's a great quote from Jim Chanos. He's a big-time short seller. He said, "When we come in every day, we know that Wall Street and the news and 10,000 public relations departments are going to be telling us that we're idiots.
Hmm.
You really got to have thick skin and be really sure of yourself to stick to your guns when everyone's telling you you're wrong."
Wow. Yeah, I can see why there's been so much pushback against short selling. I mean,
Mhm.
they've been called enemies of the state. They've faced all these strict regulations. It seems like they're always fighting an uphill battle. But from what you're saying, it sounds like they're actually super important for a healthy market.
That's right. Short selling, it encourages different opinions and it helps make sure that prices reflect, well, a more accurate view of what a company is really worth.
Okay, I'm starting to see short selling in a whole new light now.
Yeah.
So this brings us to another area you had us look at, behavioral economics. This is my favorite stuff. It's amazing how our psychology, our emotions, our biases, how all that can have such a big impact on the economic decisions we make.
Behavioral economics is really cool. It challenges that traditional idea in economics that humans are these perfectly rational actors. It acknowledges that we're all influenced by our emotions and, we take mental shortcuts and we have all these biases. And that can lead us to make choices that don't really line up with what those traditional economic models predict.
Like we've all heard about things like herd behavior. That's where we just follow the crowd, right? Or that tendency to overreact to news, whether it's good or bad. It's like we're hardwired to make irrational choices sometimes.
It's true. We all have these built-in biases. But the key thing to understand is that while one person being irrational doesn't necessarily mean the wisdom of crowds is wrong, systematic biases, those can have a huge impact on how efficient the market is.
Okay, so can you give me an example of a systematic bias that can really throw things off?
A big one is how Americans chronically undersave for retirement. Even though we know it's important to save for the future, we tend to focus on what we want right now instead of our long-term financial security. It's called present
Oh,
bias.
yeah, I know that feeling. It's like, you should be eating healthy, but you reach for the cookies anyway. But how does this individual behavior become like a collective problem?
Well, when a lot of people consistently undersave, it has this ripple effect throughout the whole economy. It puts stress on social safety nets, it reduces overall investment, and it can even slow down economic growth. So even choices that seem small when everyone's making them, they can have really big consequences.
That's kind of scary to think about. So it sounds like behavioral economics isn't just about identifying these biases. It's about finding ways to like nudge people towards making better choices. I remember reading about some of those solutions. Things like making retirement savings opt out instead of opt in, or letting people commit to saving a chunk of their future raises in advance. It's like we're tricking our brains into doing the right thing.
Exactly. These strategies use our natural biases, things like inertia and loss aversion, to our advantage. If we understand how our minds work, we can design systems that make it easier to choose what's best for us, both individually and as a society.
This is really fascinating stuff. But let's go back to the stock market for a second. If individual investors are so prone to these biases, can we really trust the market to predict the future accurately? I mean, after all, it's just a bunch of those same imperfect humans making decisions, right?
That's a great question. And it gets at this whole debate about market efficiency. You see, the efficient market hypothesis, which basically says that stock prices reflect all the available information and are therefore the best predictors of future performance, well, that's been a cornerstone of financial theory for decades.
But with all these behavioral biases floating around, it seems like the market might be more like a roller coaster ride than some perfectly rational predictive machine.
There's definitely evidence for that view. Economist Robert Shiller, he's a Nobel Prize winner, he's done a ton of research showing that stock prices tend to go up and down way more than you would expect based on changes in companies' actual value. These big swings suggest that psychological factors like fear and greed are really driving a lot of market behavior.
So the market gets caught up in all the hype, the fear, the euphoria of the moment, and prices lose touch with reality. We see that happening in bubbles and crashes, right?
Exactly. Bubbles and crashes, they're perfect examples of how those psychological factors can distort what happens in the market. And one big difference between the stock market and other types of collective intelligence, like prediction markets, is that there's rarely this clear, definite outcome that forces everyone to face reality.
It's like a horse race,
Yeah.
right? Once it's over, you know who won. But with the stock market, there's always this hope, this belief that maybe tomorrow things will turn around, even if you're, losing money on an investment.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of those biases and not get swept up in the hype. As John Maynard Keynes famously said, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate here. If the market is so prone to these wild swings, these times of irrationality, how do we explain why it's been so successful over the long haul?
That's a really good point, and it gets to the core of this whole debate about market efficiency. Even with all its flaws, the stock market has historically been really good at allocating capital and making the economy grow. One way to think about it is that while individual investors might be irrational, their mistakes kind of balance each other out, at least to some extent, when you look at the market as a whole.
So it's like that idea that having lots of different opinions is essential for making good decisions. Even if some investors are too optimistic and others are too pessimistic, the market overall kind of finds this middle ground, this equilibrium.
That's one way to put it. As long as those biases are sort of randomly spread out, the market can still work pretty well. But when a particular bias becomes really widespread, that's when you get bubbles and crashes.
So it's all about balance,
Yeah,
about having a variety of perspectives to keep things, in check.
exactly. We need those opposing forces, the bulls and the bears, to keep the market honest.
It's funny how this idea of balance keeps coming up. We talked about it with short selling, and now with this idea of different viewpoints in the market. And speaking of market bubbles, you included this really fascinating example in the stuff you sent. The bowling bubble of the 50s. What's interesting is it wasn't some new tech company or internet thing. It was, well, bowling. How did that even happen?
The bowling bubble is a classic example of how even totally normal industries can get caught up in all that speculative frenzy. It all started with a real innovation, the automatic pin setter.
So no more of those grumpy pin boys and those long waits between frames.
Exactly. This new invention caused this huge boom in bowling alley construction, and everyone suddenly loved bowling. Investors wanted to, you know, cash in on this trend, so they poured money into bowling stocks, and that drove prices way up to levels that weren't sustainable.
It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. But in this case, the tide was actually a bubble.
Precisely. Investors got caught up in the hype. They thought the short-term boom was going to last forever. They ignored all the warning signs, like how the number of bowling alleys was growing much faster than the number of people actually bowling.
Such a classic confirmation bias. They saw what they wanted to see and ignored anything that didn't fit their rosy picture.
You got it. And as prices kept climbing, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. People bought the stocks because they were going up, which just pushed prices even higher.
It's like that game of musical chairs.
Okay.
Everyone's scrambling to find a seat before the music stops.
And eventually, it did stop. The bubble burst, and investors lost a lot of money. And we were left with a ton of empty bowling alleys.
It's a good reminder that even in a market driven by collective intelligence, things can go really wrong when psychological factors like herd behavior and overconfidence take over. And what's interesting about the bowling bubble is that it shows how important information is, or maybe more accurately, misinformation in creating these speculative frenzies.
Definitely. The way information is presented and how it spreads can have a huge impact on how the market behaves. And during the bowling bubble, just like with many others, there was tons of hype and all these optimistic predictions, often without much real analysis to back them up.
It's like that old saying, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth.
Yeah, and the rise of financial news media, especially channels like CNBC, probably made this worse. The constant stream of news and commentary often focused on those short-term price changes instead of the long-term fundamentals. Well, that can make investors overreact and follow the crowd.
So instead of calming things down, all that information actually makes things more chaotic.
It's like trying to make a rational decision in a crowded room where everyone's yelling different things at you. It's really hard to think clearly and for yourself in that kind of environment.
So what are we supposed to do? Just ignore all the financial news and go with our gut?
Not necessarily. Information is still really important for making informed decisions, but we need to be aware of how our own biases and the way information is presented can affect our judgment.
This is about being like a critical consumer of information, questioning assumptions, and not getting caught up in all the hype or the fear of the moment.
Exactly. It's about realizing that even the most efficient market is still influenced by human psychology, and as we've seen, it can make mistakes. Sometimes really big ones.
Okay, I'm feeling a lot more knowledgeable about how markets work, and honestly, a little more cautious too. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to explore what all this means for us personally. How can we use these insights about collective intelligence and trust and even our own biases to make better decisions in our own lives? That's a big question, right? How do we actually take these ideas about collective intelligence and decision making and use them in our everyday lives? It's like we've seen how it all works, the machinery of the markets and how groups work, all that. But how do we use that to, I don't know, be better drivers?
I like that analogy. It really gets to the core of it. One of the most important takeaways is the power of getting different perspectives. Just like how not having enough short selling can mess up the markets, surrounding ourselves with people who only agree with us it can limit what we understand and lead to bad choices.
It makes me think about those echo chambers you see online, especially on social media. You get stuck in this bubble where all you see is stuff that already confirms what you believe.
Exactly. And that just leads to stagnation. Intellectually and in making good decisions, we really need to actively seek out viewpoints that are different from our own, even if they make us uncomfortable, or challenge what we think. It's so important for personal growth and for making good choices.
So instead of surrounding ourselves with yes men, we should be like building our own personal board of advisors, people who will, push back on our thinking and help us see things from different angles.
I love that, a personal board of advisors. And just like how corporate boards are better when they have members from different backgrounds with different expertise, our personal networks should include people who bring different perspectives and experiences.
It's like they say, two heads are better than one, but it's even better if those two heads think differently, Brad.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how groups can be both wise and, well, not so wise. How can we make sure that the groups we're in, like our work teams, community organizations, even our friends, are more likely to make good decisions? What can we do to avoid those Columbia disaster type situations?
That's such a crucial question. One of the most important things is to create this culture of open communication and what's called constructive dissent, like we saw with the Columbia disaster. Silencing dissenting voices it can be really bad. It's super important to make an environment where everyone feels comfortable speaking up, sharing their doubts, and, challenging the group's opinion.
So it's about making the group feel safe enough to disagree without being afraid of getting punished or labeled as a troublemaker.
Yes, psychological safety is huge for making good decisions as a group. When people feel like they can speak their minds freely, the group is more likely to benefit from everyone's knowledge and insights.
So that feeling of safety and open communication, that could be the difference between a successful project and, well, space shuttle disaster. And it's not just about those huge life or death decisions. These principles apply to everything, from planning a family vacation to deciding on a career change.
That's right.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much, from those surprising ways capitalism creates trust, to the risks of groupthink, to the power of behavioral economics. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
I like it. A final thought to spark some reflection.
Exactly. We've been talking about how collective intelligence can be used to solve problems, predict things, and make progress. But we've also seen how that collective wisdom can be messed up by biases, herd behavior, and even manipulation. So here's a question I want our listeners to consider. How can we, as individuals, become more responsible when we take part in these collective decision-making processes? How can we make sure that what we contribute, whether it's voting, investing, or even just sharing our opinion, is based on thoughtful judgment and not on blind faith or just reacting impulsively?
That's a really powerful question, and I think it gets to the heart of what we've been discussing today. The wisdom of Crides is it's a powerful force, but it's up to each of us to make sure that it's guided by reason, critical thinking, and a desire for the common good.
It's a tough challenge for sure, but as we've seen, the stakes are incredibly high. The future of our societies, our economies, even our planet, it all depends on our ability to make smart choices together.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep diving deep.